So let me tell you a little bit about upward mobility and the Great Gatsby curve. This is joint work with Laura Mayoral and Deborah Jouet. So clearly I'm preaching to the choir, but there has been a lot of concern about inequality and the sensation for many of us, especially living in the US or India or China, about rising inequality. However, as you can see on this graph, where we plot, or not we plot, but Povkal and Ravi Kambur plot the Gini index around 1990 and the Gini index around 2015. What you see is actually maybe a bit more nuanced picture than inequality always rising. And you see that about half of the countries have seen an increase in inequality above the dotted line, and about half of the country have seen a decrease in inequality. Inequality, and this has been motivated by the entire session, there has been a lot of concern about the link between inequality and social mobility. So the Great Gatsby curve is the brilliant name that Alan Kruger gave to the relationship, a plot that was done by Koak about plotting the relationship between intergenerational elasticity of income and the inequality, and the higher the intergenerational elasticity of income is, the less mobility there would be according to this measure, and the inequality, and there's a positive relationship, and we saw it again in many different studies, that positive relationship between the IG and the inequality. Okay, what is the IG? The intergenerational elasticity of earning. This is, how strongly children log income depends on their parents' log income. So if I think about two generations, T and T plus 1, you take the next generation income, T plus 1, and you regress it in a linear relationship on the log of the parental income. Okay? What does it mean? It means that effectively this measure is going to be, the covariance between those two things divided by the variance of this thing. And you can rework it and see that, it is essentially the correlation between the parental log income and the children log income multiplied by what I'm going to call the dispersion. So the correlation is more akin to the measure that Diogo presented to us, that is the rank-rank correlation. And this is, capturing exchange mobility. So this is about switching position. This is invariant to scale, growth rates, or income distribution. And then the other component that comes into DIG is what I can call a dispersion. And this is the ratio of the standard deviation of the log income of the children divided by the standard deviation of the log income of the children. Although it's not properly an inequality measure because it does not satisfy the Dalton principle, but it's often a very good proxy for a measure of inequality. So essentially, this is going to be higher if inequality is increasing versus decreasing, okay? Which we're going to see is going to be closer to the measure of upward mobility that we developed with Deborah Jouet. And, this means that change in inequality is going to affect the IG separately from the correlation or the exchange mobility. And maybe we want to distinguish between those two things more clearly. Okay? So upward mobility, this is a measure that we developed with Deborah Jouet in 2023. And although it took us years, but this is when it was published. But you know, what we wanted was a measure of mobility. There's many measures of mobility out there, and so essentially what you want is a measure that captures what you mean, and we did not find what we meant. We wanted a measure that would be directional, okay? That is, going up is better, going down is worse, okay? And we are going to call it upward mobility, not because we're only looking at movement up, but because we want it to contribute positively when it goes up and negatively when it goes down. We also wanted something about, you know, equity and about growth that would be more inclusive. Growth per se, it very much matters where it's happening in the distribution. And so what we wanted is to say that if you redistribute some growth from someone that is richer to someone that is poor, this is going to be increasing upward mobility. This is going to mean less money. It's decreasing the pie. But in order to capture some mobility, you want actually the growth, you prefer growth happening in lower level of the distribution rather than higher. Okay? So let's take a little example. Here it would be a path of two people. And if I take 2% growth rate from the richest person and we distribute to the poorest person, I would say this is more upwardly mobile. Okay? And it does not matter that they are growing. That can happen when they are going down, when they are not moving, and so on. However, to conceptualize that, we have a problem if there's some crossing. So here, I put a picture of two people's trajectory of income, and what happens if A was originally poor, but now, you know, this was Bill Gates, and A became way richer than B. Do you want to keep on putting more weight on his, growth, if, despite the fact that at some point he got richer? So what we said is no. What we wanted is those weights to be evolving with the position of individual in the distribution. So what do? What we did is to say, okay, let me first define a measure of instantaneous upward mobility. Why the instant? It's because in the instant, crossing cannot happen. So then I can apply the axiom that I want without worrying about crossing. So if I take everybody's baseline income at an instant t and their growth rate, then what I can do is that I can put axioms that says that I want to reward growth. So whenever someone is growing more or less negatively, upward mobility is going to go up. And I want that whenever I redistribute some growth from someone with a higher baseline income to someone that is with a lower baseline income, it goes up, okay? So this, together with some other axioms, some separability, is going to give me an instantaneous measure of mobility that I can capture at every instant that is essentially going to be a measure of poor growth, with the weight being dependent on the baseline income of the individual at that moment. Then what do we do when we are thinking about the entire interval? If I take the entire interval, we put two more axioms, but that are going to essentially result in a measure of upward mobility over a time interval from S to T that is just going to be the average instantaneous upward mobility over the period. Okay? So when I do that, what do I get? What I get is a measure of absolute upward mobility. What this measure of absolute upward mobility is doing is essentially taking, what we see is that this measure is going to essentially be similar to a measure of growth. So if everybody was growing at the same rate, if we had balanced growth rate in this economy, then my measure of upward mobility would be equal to that balanced growth that we have seen. But whenever the growth is not going to be balanced, this is going to be higher if the growth has been pro-poor, and it's going to be lower if it's not. Okay, so from this, I can also subtract the average growth rate in the economy and get purely the relative component, the redistributive component of the growth from it. Okay, so crucially, those measures are panel independent and they're path independent, okay? So, and I'm going to argue that yes, to, measure mobility of a particular dynasty, you need to follow that dynasty. But when you're assessing the upward mobility in the society, you want the weight to be changing with people's situation. And so in that case, you don't need to a panel data, and the exchange mobility is cancelling out from this measure. Okay? So, and it's very much related to the Atkinson welfare in the sense that, the absolute upward mobility is essentially the continuous growth rate of an Atkinson measure of inequality. Okay. So what do I want to show you in the 1 minute that I have left is what we wanted to do is to actually look at that question of the Great Gatsby curve with a measure of mobility. And essentially, why is that an interesting question? Because I can plot any variable on the x-axis and the y-axis, but it's particularly interesting because essentially what you're doing is looking at a dynamic equation for the evolution of economic inequality. Why? Because I just told you that mobility is a measure of how equalizing growth has been. When you look at the relative upward mobility, it's just how equalizing the mobility has been. And then you look at how inequality at baseline, what inequality at baseline means for how much equalization you have. So that allows us to distinguish between situations where you might have an inequality trap, like if you're at a low level of inequality, you're going to get a decrease in inequality. When you're at a higher level of equality, you're going to see an increase or convergence. And what do we find? I'm going to show you the graph. What we find is that very much when you look at a measure of upward mobility, what you find is not what we expected to find. You find actually a tendency for inequality. When there's an increase in inequality at baseline, it's followed by a decrease in inequality. There's a reversal to, if you want, a steady state level of inequality within the country when you look at over time. So we did not find any evidence of an inequality trap, but actually more inequality would be followed by a decrease in inequality, less in inequality followed by an increase in inequality. And I'm going to stop here. This is something that is very robust. This is actually the most robust finding that I've ever had to work with. And so I'm going to leave you with this.